This is called The Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Handley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
On this episode, we have 2 listener questions. Danny has mixed emotions about Father's Day. He's trying to balance his needs with the demands of parenting and wants to hear more about fatherhood. He's also curious if being a psychiatrist changes our views on parenting. Michelle is a newly minted therapist and has questions about the role of transference and countertransference in our sessions. And she'd like to know if we have any advice for someone just starting out as a therapist. Listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. This first question comes from Danny. He sent this to us almost a year ago. It was mid-June 2022. It was just before Father's Day. And as you'll hear, questions about fathers and parenting. And my father had just died a couple of weeks before we got the question. I think I had just gotten home from the funeral. And we sat down to record the episode. And you, Abby, gave me permission to not do this question right away. And
I invited you to, I think, in fact, but go ahead.
No, I was just relieved. And then I just started avoiding it. And now a year has gone by and we're back to Father's Day. So we thought we'd give it a try.
I appreciate your tenacity. Let's see what happens.
And also, Danny may not even still listen to this podcast. But if he does, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry we didn't answer it last spring, but now you know why. And we'll give it a go.
It's a good reason, but it's also one you can only use once, Dave. So here we go.
All right. So this is from Danny.
Tomorrow is Father's Day. I have mixed emotions about it based on my childhood. My dad was an alcoholic who later abandoned our family. I've worked hard to build a different kind of life for my own wife and children. But sometimes I still struggle balancing the demands of work and my own wants with the responsibility of being a parent. I listened to a podcast where Dave talked about the number of books he read to get ready for his own children. I wondered if you could talk about what it means to be a father. I'd appreciate hearing more. I'm also wondering how being a psychiatrist changes your views on parenting. Do your kids benefit from your informed point of view? I bet when they are teenagers, the challenges are different.
So I suppose since Danny isn't my patient, it's okay if I over-identify with him. Danny, if we compared notes, I'm sure we would find that we have a lot in common. But I wanted to start with his idea that he wants to build a different kind of life for his family. And I think what resonated with me is that I spent a lot of my life trying not to be my father. But, it didn't occur to me until after he died that some of my insistence for most of my adult life of not having kids was actually tied to that idea. So I spent, like I say, probably from reproductive age until the year before I had a child, not wanting to be a father, very adamant about it, that I didn't like kids. I mean, it was something I made sure everybody knew so that no one thought I could be convinced about it. And I think in retrospect, what happened, or I think what I must have believed is that if I became a father, then there would be a role that I shared with my own father, and that somehow that would undo me. The dam would collapse or something.
Sure. I would say, did you also have yourself convinced that that's really not what you wanted?
Yeah, no, I was 100% convinced. I was not very aware of where it came from, but no, it was.
You believed it. Everybody around you believed it.
I at least wanted them to believe it.
Your wife? Okay.
Yeah, no, I told, right when I was married,
convinced.
Yeah, it was definitely a part of me. And the reason I think it's pertinent to Danny's question is because he's talking about balancing his needs, like his parenting needs and his other roles. Because at least for me, like when you're trying so hard to go against what you know, I think you can overcorrect. And I definitely did that. Like I went overboard, and I don't regret what I did. It's how I managed. But, in retrospect, it wasn't necessary. And I was aware of that while I was doing it, but I didn't know what the alternative might look like.
So how did it change? Do you know?
I think there was just an accrual of so much evidence over so much time, right? I mean, that I was just like in a good spot in my life. Things had worked out for me. I was in a great relationship. I had a decent career. Like felt like I was a good person. And I think when all that kind of fell into place, I don't know. I didn't need to hold on to that anymore. Because again, this wasn't something I was completely conscious of. I mean, I knew that there was some fear lurking there, but about the actual fatherhood itself, I had not made that connection. And in fact, I had made that connection until just in the last year.
Well, and then as Danny said, it sounds like once you knew you were going to become a father, you went kind of all in on preparing. Probably another way to try to help lock in that difference.
Oh, yeah. When he's talking about I don't even remember
the books.
I don't remember which episode he was. Yeah, I mean, I remember the content. I don't remember where it is. But,
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the bigger principle there was just in general, not just about fatherhood, but if I'm faced with uncertainty or anxiety, I just try to over-intellectualize it. I read everything.
Yeah.
I go down a rabbit hole as a way to just try to choke that out, to try to remove myself from whatever emotion I'm having.
Yeah, and then you master it, right? And then you were told, let me guess.
I mean, it's an illusion.
Totally ready?
Right.
You were ready and it totally prepared you for being a dad? I just don't think people can be ready. But, my patients will tell me, oh, I'm nervous, I'm worried, apprehensive in some way about becoming a parent. And I'm like, good, that means you're paying attention, right? I mean, I'm far more worried about the person who just thinks they've got it.
Yeah, we've talked about that before. Yeah, the people that have all that confidence or who aren't anxious about it, they're the ones that, the people that even ask like what kind of parent they are, what are they doing right, what are they doing wrong. I don't worry about them as much as the ones that think they've got it all figured out.
Yeah,
but I think that my strategy that he was asking about, it's a self-imposed illusion. That it's just making you feel better in the moment, but you also know that it's just it's just a way to cope.
I would say, and there's way worse ways to cope, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, reading lactation books is not. There's not a lot of downside.
There's really not. I mean, the intellectualization is a higher defense. It's okay.
So, but I wanted to get back to his question about balancing his needs, because I do think that men should be talking about this more. But I do have to point out to Danny that, you moms have been in this struggle for generations now. So
I know there is I want to be kind to you, but there is a part of me that's like, yes, this is one of the few times we need to hear more from the men. Please keep going.
Well, the reason I bring it up is I'm not trying to scold Danny. I'm just saying that in case he's not aware, his wife also is having the same dilemma. Every modern parent faces the dilemma. Co-parents, anybody you're sharing child rearing responsibilities with, you need to have this conversation about how to support each other. How can we help each other? So I just wanted to let him know that that's his best partner to figure out some of this in terms of how do we prioritize and make sure that we're still in that list.
And that's your best chance of balancing it, right?
Yeah.
Is if both people are in on that. Do you have hot tips? Like how has that been for you?
Oh, no, I didn't balance it at all. No,
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
No, my way of managing it was to eliminate all things from my life that were not the number 1 and 2 priority, which was, my kid and my spouse. So I'm not a model here at all.
Okay.
That was the best I could do. And as I said earlier, I don't necessarily regret that, but it would have been nice. I probably didn't have to give up all of my friends and all exercise and all hobbies, right?
We came back. It's okay.
Yeah. You were gone for a lot of people were gone for a long time. So, so Danny asks what it means to be a father. And honestly, I'm not sure exactly what he needs here. I'm speculating that he's not sure if what he's feeling is the quote unquote right way to feel. So I wanted to start by saying there's no right definition. It's not universal, even in our society. And when you start looking across cultures, there really is nothing universal about it. Right. Again, I think mothers probably do this and have done it forever, but guys also have no problem telling other guys what it's going to be like when they have a kid or when they get married or any of these life events. You get lots and lots of, it's going to be like this, and you're going to do this, you're going to feel this way. And I think for the person hearing it, then they don't know how to reconcile with their own experience. The person saying it, of course, they don't want there to be any room for uncertainty, right? If this is how I felt it, it must be a universal concept.
Right. And I don't know if there's as many I think you might be right that there might be maybe a bigger variety in a way of ideal ways to be a father, because I think the kind of flip side of that, you're right. I think mothers maybe share that or talk about that. And that's probably kind of this competitive momming is maybe a discussion for a different time. But I do think there's kind of cultural expectation, for example, that that you live up to these stereotypes that people will say, oh my God, the moment my baby was born was the most incredible moment of my life. And I felt completely in love and so happy and all this stuff. And like, that's not the experience for everybody. But I think there's a taboo against speaking out when it's not what the ideal is or not what the common thing is. I mean, and I know we've referenced that some in other episodes, but I think maybe whatever the group decides is the way to be is the thing that gets talked about. And then if you differ from that, it is all too easy to kind of suffer in silence.
And I think a lot of this, as you're saying, the cultural knowledge would come. Like Danny would have gotten that from his own father. Well, his own father abandoned them. So he doesn't even have any kind of frame of reference about what it's supposed to be like.
Right.
So I don't know. I've talked to a lot of men about fatherhood. I mean, there's patients, of course, and maybe that's what he's interested in, friends, coworkers. It's such a wide spectrum, right? I mean, there's men that are resentful of their children. Some regret having kids. Some feel trapped. Some abandon their kids, like Danny's dad. Others only like their kids when they're interactive or they can talk. Some, it's just
I think some dads think a good dad is a disciplinarian. Some dads think a good dad is the fun guy all the time, right? I mean, like there's so many different ways.
Some dads, it's just this narcissistic extension. And then some enjoy actually providing care for a child. They're a little more dialed in. And I think people can move through many of these different scenarios, depending on where they are in their lives.
And some of that is meaningful, but I also think, I guess I want to give permission to that it's okay to have ages of your children that click better with you and your interests. I don't think that means that you get to kind of opt out. I've heard of more men than women, to be honest, like you said, kind of saying, well, I'll play with the kid or, I'll participate when he can throw a ball or, when they can do whatever. But I also, maybe that's just a guess. Maybe Danny has really little kids and he doesn't know quite as well how to deal with babies or toddlers. That doesn't mean he can't try. And it certainly doesn't mean that trying doesn't matter, but school age kids or teenagers might be, more of a natural fit for him. And I think that's okay too. Both, we'll talk about that more, but parenting definitely, I think, changes people again, hopefully, if they're paying attention. But there's just going to be a lot of phases to fatherhood also, I have to assume.
Yeah. And they change so much. You're right. Like you may be struggling now and it may actually get easier in a year from now. It's really hard to predict. So I don't know if he wants to know about my experience personally. I don't know. I don't want to overread into the question or just continue to have a confessional.
I am into the confessional. There's nothing to absolve you of yet. I'm waiting for it. It's totally something I can grant, by the way. But I don't know. I mean, do you want to say what it means to you to be a father? Do you have an answer? And do you have an answer that's not just like the best and worst thing I ever did? I mean,
it's probably this one part of my life that I allow myself to be the most sentimental, the most maudlin about. So, well, there's nothing that I've done that's clearly correct, but I will say, here's how I think about it. I would sacrifice myself for my wife. And I don't think that's unique. But what I thought was so interesting is that feeling didn't just happen overnight. Like that's not a second date kind of thing, right? You're like, hey, you're going to go to a movie and
I'll take a
bullet. You want me to catch you?
Right, yeah.
And so there was something that was very unusual for me to experience that with my daughter. That feeling was so immediate, like that sense that something is so much more important than I am. And the emotion around that was so primal and so instinctual. And it was something I had never really felt before. And it's almost comical to me, to kind of tap into some like animalistic part of ourselves, where it was like, my genes will survive
or something. Yes. People would say like, oh, what's the most surprising part of motherhood for you? And my line remains is like, how much of a cliche I am, how much of a cliche, every cliche, right? Like I too have the most beautiful children in the world, right? Like I too, right? Like nothing more miraculous has ever happened. And I've never been more tired. And right, like, and all, I mean, the good things and the bad things and the long days and the short years. And like, there's just like all the stuff to say, but it is true.
Yeah.
Again, even if it doesn't happen right away, but yeah, the this is a totally different kind of love. That's there. That's different.
I never felt my priorities be so crystal clear. There was no ambiguity. There was no pro-con. And I had never felt so vulnerable before.
Right.
Like that so much could now be out of my control. Like the most important thing.
And that kid was doing nothing for you except existing, which is also amazing.
I know. It was just a blob
right.
of organs and cells. Yeah. So one reason I think I hesitate to even talk about that, though, is because if you're that's not to say that that's how everybody should experience it. But anyway, that's how it felt. I mean, and I think that's been the principle that I've operated on since.
And I think that's good and wonderful. Even my daughter the other night was like, do you love me or daddy more? And I was just, somehow her brother wasn't in the calculation. Like
that
usual. Yeah. But I just, I was like, oh, it's different. And it's like, well, how? And it's kind of like, and that's sort of what it came down to. Like, it's not that my love for him necessarily is contingent on that, but it's like, dear daughter, I don't actually expect anything from you. Like, you being there is the reason I love you, right? There was no choice. There was no, and I can't imagine my life without you. And yeah, you're right that the priorities are there. I mean, never say never, but I don't think I'm trying to get my needs met with my kids. Thank goodness, right? Like there's no reciprocity or not as much reciprocity there. But it was an interesting challenge, both thinking about this question and also just navigating that of, well, what is the difference? Like without being jerky about it. It has to grow and it ebbs and flows over time. But for me, the love for my children is not a wavering thing. It doesn't need to be examined in the same way either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other outcome for me, I gained an emotional life that I'd never had before. I suddenly had so much more depth to me.
That's great.
Yeah, it was really, and that wasn't a transactional. It wasn't like,
no.
It wasn't because it was servicing my needs. It was just like I just had never experienced that.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right? To get to whatever age and be like, yeah, and that's, again, cheesy but true. How I would describe it to my kids too. It's like a whole new part of my heart opened up that I literally didn't know was there. It's pretty amazing. I'm into it. What can I say?
Yeah. So are we done being cheesy? Are we going to move on now to his question about
being a psychiatrist and a parent at the same time?
A psychiatrist parent. Yeah. I think
that's a way more mixed bag, I gotta say.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think everybody assumes that a psychiatrist kid's going to be weird. And I would just say, I think if we were radiologists, our kids would be a little odd, right?
Yeah, how dare you? Absolutely. That is the stereotype. And, I'm not going to say it's unfair, but yeah. But yes, I would extend that to most doctors. There's some real occupational hazards there. Well, and a chicken or the egg thing. The thing that leads people to do these types of jobs may not always be the thing that leads to some normal parenting. Recognizing that normal is a problematic word.
Yeah,
I'm trying to be vague.
Well, just in case Danny thought, I want to dispel any ideas that being a psychiatrist does not make you a better parent at all. There's no special.
I don't think it's an accident that my children are perfect.
So here's the thing.
Anybody who knows me knows I don't think that. Continue.
No, so here's the thing that I think my professional training might help me do. I may be more aware in the moment when I'm doing a bad job. It doesn't mean that I stop doing the wrong thing, but at least I can observe myself in real time messing up. If it was a patient, I could intervene, but there's just too many emotions involved when it's your own family. So, So yeah, I don't know. Maybe because my observing ego is so developed, like I can see it happening, but it doesn't mean I can change it.
Right. And there, that is a part where, like you said, so many emotions, probably conflicting needs. Sometimes, I might have a need for control or a need for to get out the door to go to freaking school or whatever. There are pressures that get in the way. So yeah, I think that's it. I think the thing that I think is a positive thing that maybe my training has done differently than other people or, some other people is like naming of emotions. So my daughter was riding a trike or something and hit a bump in the sidewalk and fell off. And she was really angry. She was little. and had a huge tantrum and, like threw the trike into the street and was like stomping her foot. And she really couldn't talk that well, but she was like, I'm so frustrated. And my friend was like, oh, really? She knows how to say frustrated, but she doesn't know like how to regulate the rest of it. And I was like, that's right. My kids know what emotions are. Or, now my daughter will say, well, I'm depressed. And yes, mommy, I know. Really what I mean is I'm just sad today. It's not like depression that goes on for a really long time that you need to talk to somebody about, right? She's old enough that she's heard my tirades against pretending that normal emotions are mental illness. So I don't actually, that's more of a mixed bag one, but at least the message was clear that sadness and depression are different. And I feel kind of good about that.
Yeah, my kid's really good at observing behavior, but I think that may be more temperament than it is anything about me. We're so much alike, but again, that has nothing to do with my training. That just has something to do with,
they're temperamental things. I'm just talking about kind of the vocabulary and the willingness to talk about it. I think one of the ways this was hard for me, hopefully not too damaging to my kids, is that especially with my first child, I was a brand new psychiatrist and right out of residency when he was born, and I still worked at the hospital. And I was often monitoring him for, what I thought might be signs or symptoms or like, really early things of like future mental illness or probably more specifically just anything wrong with him. And I think some of that is just medical training to sort of be like fault finders or, like where's the lesion or where's the problem. Maybe some of that definitely was just some anxiety about being a new parent. But my husband would just be like, can you like calm down? He's fine. And there's nothing to do. And I'd be like, yeah, but this thing, and I don't know. And I think I kind of worked myself out of that with time and distance and experience and a really good pediatrician. But I think there was a part of me that wanted to be so on alert to notice something, which is probably, also some of my upbringing, both in terms of family and just era of, I wanted to make sure that, whatever was going on was going to get noticed.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I did a bunch of weird stuff. I did a bunch of unusual things that had nothing to do with anxiety. I was just fascinated. I was fascinated by all the primitive reflexes. Like I was curious when the Babinski would actually extinguish. So all like the developmental milestones, like the deep cut, I wasn't monitoring it because I thought anything was wrong. I just monitored it because I was fascinated. It was kind of
wanted to see it. You're just like
a
tapping
case
your forehead
study
all the time. And
well, I remember checking.
Yeah, but what if she didn't do it on time? You might have freaked out.
No, I really didn't. I really was.
Right.
I felt quite confident that there's nothing wrong with this child. But I was interested in when her eyes would cross the midline or when she could grasp across. And so that I would do things to see. Like I would test that.
Sure, not just look me in the eye, baby.
Well, and just like like her spatial reasoning was really felt kind of off the charts. And I was interested to just, again, out of my own curiosity, was like really fascinated. So yeah, there's some like weird science doctor kind of stuff, I guess, that's mixed in there, but that doesn't cause any harm. It's certainly about parenting.
Oh, I don't think so. But yeah, and then I think later when I did analytic training and I had an infant and a toddler, then to really see the developmental things happen in real time, maybe in kind of the same way, it was really exciting. And I think sometimes that might even maybe helped a little bit with coping when those things are really hard, right? Where it's like, okay, my kid is having this tantrum, but this is exactly what he's supposed to do right now, right? Or like, okay, this is really frustrating, but I'm going to calm myself down by recognizing that my child is a world-class 2-year-old, right? Like nobody has ever been more 2 than this. This is what's happening. And so, yeah, maybe it made some of the stuff I had studied more solidified and a little more fun. And maybe I could be a little more chill and curious about what was happening because it really did seem to follow pretty typical enough timelines of development, right? And now I get to talk to people who are parents and draw on my experience, but there's also people who are my patients, with older children who I admire. And just the more people you talk to and hear about their experiences, I think I get to learn things too. Not just from my curiosity, but it's like, oh, well, that's how that person worked through that issue with their teenager. Like if I ever come across that seems like not a bad way to go.
Yeah, so I've got 2 principals from therapy that I think
Great.
serve parents well. So one is that you have to dig very, very deep to find empathy. So with young kids, so here's an example like from my life. So my daughter's life was destroyed one day when she realized that she couldn't climb onto the roof of the shed the way the cats could. So she thought she was inadequate. She was never going to self-actualize. She was never going to be a cat. So
Did
it was
she
like,
use those words?
no,
Because
but
I was like, wow, man, you gave her too many vocabularies.
but
Anyway,
she was, the point is like, it's the meltdown, right? Over the most
sure.
innocuous things. I mean, there's once when my wife flushed the toilet, but in fact, she wanted to be the one to flush the toilet, right? So it's just a complete meltdown. And so what I would, on my best days, it would be not looking at the stimulus, but looking at the response and thinking, okay, so what would it take in my life to have that kind of reaction? And when somebody has lost their mind like that, you have to like, you have to be really empathic. And I was imagining, so basically, I guess what I'm saying is I would treat her as if, like a really, like a psychotic person who's, having a really hard time because otherwise it could be infuriating, right? It's a barrier to whatever you need to get done. And it's just like, no, because this is actually really scary. To have lost your mind. You just have to divorce yourself from like what happened. Because it's probably actually developmentally fine, like you were saying earlier.
Right. Or I guess conversely, if there is someone, maybe really regressed with borderline personality disorder, having a tantrum, if you can remember that, okay, this is developmentally appropriate for a 2-year-old, it doesn't mean you put up with it, but I think it helps with empathy in that situation too, right? To be like, oh, wow, this person went back to this really early state.
And I think it applies to, it obviously applies to like the preteens and the teenagers too, but because whatever it is, it's still in your adult mind is still trivial. Somebody didn't say you see, somebody looked at you wrong, whatever. But it's only petty to us because, we have a fully organized brain. And so I think when you, again, if you can kind of take away
access, hopefully.
And find that empathy. So I think that is helpful. And then my other principle, which I guess we're going to talk about this later in the show about the transference thing, would always be the question of like, is it me or is it them?
Right.
Like with a young kid, when you're starting to lose your cool, it's not often just their behavior. Like we get embarrassed because they're acting like a fool. And we think somebody's going to judge us. And it may not just be strangers. It may be your partner. It may be your family. And it may even be yourself. Like it's almost like it becomes evidence that I am not doing a good job. And so the emotion you have around there actually has all to do with you and not with them. That you're going to punish them because you think you're a bad parent in that moment. So I think sometimes like slowing down the process and being like, is it me or is it them? And then same thing with the older kids. I think maybe even more importantly with the older kids because we do project so much onto our kids. Because we see our mistakes, we see our weaknesses in them. We want things to be different for them. The example I thought of for this one is my daughter recently, gets dressed for the day. And, if fashion is a statement we make about ourselves, then this was just word salad. And so there's this part of me that thinks, okay, well, my job is to maybe educate her about how clothes are supposed to be secured to our bodies or how they fit or something about color theory or whatever. But it's not, no, it's just about me, right? It's just about that I fear that she'll get excluded. I fear she'll get made fun of because I may have gotten excluded or I may have gotten teased or something like that. So it's about me. And so that means I actually just need to keep my mouth shut, right?
Right. And she gets to work that out on her own.
Exactly right. It's all about, at this point anyway, it's social learning. So.
And you actually don't know what she's trying to say. This doesn't make sense, right? But there's not, I don't know what they look like now. Are you trying to be a prep or a jock? I don't know. No, who knows what the kids are doing.
So those are my
I love it.
My top 2 parenting tips that comes from maybe some work in psychotherapy.
Danny also asks about teenagers, and I think it kind of goes with everything you just said, right? I mean, they do regress. There is this way where said child can go from acting 6 to acting like he thinks he's 16 in a matter of moments. And the irrationality of it and kind of trying to balance. I mean, it's like a toddler balancing the needs for independence and separation with the need to be close and be coddled and be a baby. And I think that this may be one of the more challenging phases for me yet to come, but we'll see. We'll see what buttons get pushed.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to let go, right?
Right.
You have this idea that you have so much control.
Right.
Well, for example, there were no sunburns, right, when I was in control of the sunscreen, and now it's it's like, so what? Which of these battles is important? Well, skin cancer is a big one, so I guess I'll battle that
he
one.
He came back from skiing last week with a literal blister on his nose. Yeah. And I felt like a bad mom, but would I have been a worse mom if I would have held down my preteen and like slathered it all over his face? I mean,
yesterday,
like, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, yesterday I was trying to convey something that was about to happen. And so I intentionally said it 5 times over a short period of time, said it in different ways. No, sure. She had no idea.
She didn't listen to any of the 5 ways.
That's
amazing.
I even said, like, I said this 5 times, hoping that even if you only listened to 5% of what I said, that with each iteration you would get enough to know where I was. No.
Right.
Yeah. So
no, none of it. That's amazing.
So now I'm back to prefacing everything. Like, so now I prioritize. I have to sort of think about what I'm going to say and then prioritize what I'm about to say is important. Please make eye contact.
Right. Can you say that back to me?
Yep, I'll do the repeat this back. I can talk for 10 minutes, but this is actually the one thing I want you to know. So let's just cut to the chase.
Oh God. Yeah, and it's nice not to be needed so much, but the truth is they need us more than they think they do. It's all a balance. It's always a balance. I don't know. I think the best tip is like you have to love your kid and do your best, and that's probably the only thing that like applies to everybody. And I will give my husband credit for that one because I'll like over worry and say, what are we going to do? And he says, we just have to keep loving them. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's actually not bad advice, right? I mean, you figure out what that means, but I hope Danny's still listening. I hope he got what he wanted.
Yeah, no, but I do have one book recommendation.
Oh, please.
Because I read a lot about this.
Sure.
But this actually is not a parenting book at all. It's not advice. It's not self-help. It's actually this anthropologist at the University of Utah, David Lancey. Okay. So almost any of his work is fascinating. He's probably I think he's the first person to actually look at the anthropology of childhood. And again, there's no take-home point, there's no action items, but it puts things in perspective that the way we parent now in the modern era is so radically different than almost all of human history.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes just some reassurance of, like this new trend is not, if you're not doing that, it's probably okay. Right. And I think it broadens your mind to the idea of what child rearing looks like and understanding it through history and understanding it through cultural context. And anyway, I think
it doesn't actually tend to be that fragile, right? I mean, it's hard to really make such a bad mistake that you're going to irreversibly mess up your child. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, I think you have to do your best. You have to correct, you have to try, but missing one thing or not doing one thing the way that everybody else is doing it or whatever. You know what I mean? I mean, like people have survived and persevered and figured things out through all kinds of things. And it's not saying like everything's fine, but I think there is a way of saying like, you don't need so much pressure to get it exactly right because there is no such thing.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
We're
rambling. We've probably lost Danny.
All right. Well, we maybe lost him when we didn't answer his question for a year, but I swear it was a good reason.
All right.
Danny, we abandoned you before, but we're back.
Yeah. So let us know if you still listen and let us know if this is helpful. Again, sorry for the delay.
Thanks for your question. That was a good one. Good luck.
Dancing just you and me. Cha-cha-cha.
This feedback comes from James. It's titled Heartfelt and Informative Show. I learned a lot from your episode today about cancellations, ongoing long-term therapy, and psychoanalysis, and the monetary value of your time. As a patient considering psychoanalysis, it's helpful to hear views from the other side of the couch. Thank you for your transparency and heartfelt feedback.
That is such a nice review. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. This question comes from Michelle. I've just completed my degree and I'm getting ready to start my integrative therapy practice. I'm trained in CBT and I've also taken some classes in psychodynamic psychotherapy. I wondered if you could talk more about the role of transference and countertransference in your sessions. What are the indications of when you're experiencing transference? How do you cope with your countertransference? Are you able to do this in session, or do you need to wait to process when the experience has settled? I've read some papers that indicate transference, countertransference is the therapy, while others focus on theory and techniques. Has your approach evolved over time? What is your best advice for therapists who are just starting out? Well, first of all, congratulations on completing your degree.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, they always would, the professors and instructors and attendings had some sort of maxim about how the enthusiasm of beginning therapists is enough to make up for the experience of the older therapists who apparently are, I don't know, haggard and tired or something. So, I like that Michelle is asking these questions, and hopefully we can come up with some advice for her. But I think coming in, being curious and enthusiastic is a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, I think we could just take them like one at a time, but
Sure.
Before we do that, and I don't want to be too duplicative because I know we've covered this on other episodes, but should we just do a quick rundown of the terms in case we've got
I think
some
that's
new
helpful.
folks? Okay.
Totally. I'll start with transference. Transference in therapy is when the patient is transferring their feelings about someone from their past onto the therapist. And I think it's important to point out that this is something that's unconscious or outside of the person's awareness, right? At least at the beginning. Countertransference is a little bit different. So that is the therapist's reaction to the client or patient's transference to them. So countertransference is a reaction to the transference. It's important to note, which again gets really confusing, that the therapist can also be having transference about the patient, but that's not really what we're talking about here.
I think we should include that. I hear a lot of people using the therapist transference and calling that countertransference.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay to think of that the therapist could have two different reactions, one being their own
Absolutely.
transference, one being the idea of the transfer. So,
Mhm.
why don't we keep that in there just as
Okay.
we kind of move through this?
Great. Let's keep it in there.
I also wanted to share an example that one of our teachers, shared with me, and I think it's maybe it's helpful. It's just a metaphor. When you think about crossing the street at an intersection, you first have to learn the flow of traffic. You learn how the lights work. You learn when it's your turn to walk. And then the next time you come to two intersecting roads, you don't have to relearn all of that. So part of that is just a mental shortcut that can then be applied to all these other scenarios. So it doesn't matter if you're at a different intersection, a bigger intersection. Our brains kind of develop these shortcuts because that's more efficient. If we had to go back and relearn how to cross the street every time we came upon two streets that were intersecting, that'd be ridiculous. And so the same idea, again, this is a metaphor. This isn't how our brains necessarily work, but the same idea applies to relationships. Like we make mental shortcuts about our interactions with each other. You have an idea about an interaction with a cashier at a coffee counter, or an interaction with older men or with police officers. We take some information and we find a category to put it in so that we can understand it. I think it's an efficiency thing. Sometimes it's adaptive and sometimes it isn't. So, for example, if every person in authority makes you act as if they were your abusive uncle, then that could get in the way. Figuring out how to get through the line at the airport, though, that's probably more of an adaptation. And so the question, I think, in my mind is not whether transference happens, it's whether it would be useful or therapeutic to shine a light on the transference, to make it conscious, because it happens all the time.
And not just in therapy.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's part of that it's happening with all human interactions. And, I know it's a stereotype, right, that therapists are really, and sometimes a joke, that we're really interested in people's mothers or early figures, I guess, early attachment figures, people in their life. But part of that is because those are the first relationship or even people templates that, we come across in our lives. So I guess that's the first intersection, right, that you went to, that you learned how to do that, or how to cross that, or how to be with people, maybe certain types of people based on some of the earliest and or most important people in your life. But yeah, but to your point, it's happening all the time. it's happening in all sessions for sure. But, sometimes people will come into therapy early on and say, just so you know, I don't do transference. Like, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for me. And it's like, okay, right? I mean, so we're not going to talk about that for a while.
I had that recently come up in a
oh yeah,
in kind of a termination where it was like, well, it's not as if there was transference, and I was like, well, in fact, there had been interpreted.
Right, sure.
It was a long time ago, but
right.
It was. I think I said I was like, well, it's not that it didn't; it's whether it was useful to you for us to look at it. Right. And it is, and even if you don't make it a focus of therapy, it's still very informational for the therapist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think about you can't know a person's entire life, in 50-minute increments once a week or twice a week. The only thing you can actually know purely is the relationship you have with them here and now. And often understanding that opens up a lot about the rest of their life.
And that, people come in and they are going to make assumptions. And I know we've talked about that before on the podcast in terms of maybe certain biographical or other facts, but it may be assumptions about how much they can trust you or what the boundaries might be, right? And so I think when she says what are the indications when you're experiencing transference, she means when is a patient having a strong transference. And again, I guess the general idea is like the indication is that they're there and they're talking to you, but there's different types of transference. I think sometimes it stands out when someone is treating you like you are very untrustworthy, right? Or very scary. And that you have done everything you can to have a soothing, safe environment, or that you haven't done anything as far as you can tell to be scary. And so, this person tends to approach people with mistrust, or, they're slow to build trust. And, I guess that could be kind of a basic transference thing, right? And that's also maybe like the patient from last week or the writer where the patient is saying, oh, I feel like you're dismissive, or I feel like you're angry. And the therapist is like, well, I'm not. Right? Instead of being really curious and saying, well, I wonder why you might feel that way, or just having curiosity about it. And which I guess answers the next question. I'm sorry, I'm going through them, but like, how do you cope with countertransference? I think you be curious about it, right? I mean, you be curious and notice it and use it as information.
Yeah. So then to her question about can you do it in session, the more experience you have with it, the easier it is to monitor in real time. I mean, we all have blind spots, and sometimes it takes some distance to understand it, especially when emotions are running high.
Right.
I was thinking, though, there are certain types of personalities and histories that elicit very specific reactions in me. And I feel those right away. And then it helps me to investigate them to see if my reaction is valid or if it's countertransference. And so that's something that's very helpful, like gaining either insight into somebody's experience or sometimes even helping with a diagnosis.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit just like tuning into that spidey sense and then taking avenues of inquiry that, often, on the patient side, they wonder how you might know all these things. And you're really just, you're just inquiring about a feeling that you're having in reaction to them, because it is important to, make the distinction about your reactions versus your countertransference and sorting that out.
Yeah, but that can be the more practiced you are, the more experience you have. Yeah, if you feel a certain way when someone with a narcissistic personality structure comes through the room, you don't want to say like, oh, my gut is so evidence-based, but you can use that as really helpful information. And then, as you're saying, Dave, this is just saying it in different words, go on to confirm, change, refine your intuition about that. And so, yeah, you can do it, I think, at the same time, and reflecting is also never a problem, but we all get caught up in it, right? I mean, it doesn't, I wouldn't say that anybody's perfectly attuned all the time to exactly what's happening.
No. And you're right. Yeah. I'm glad you elaborated, because you shouldn't just trust your gut. It's your gut tells you it's a signal to pursue something, to actually confirm or deny. Yeah. Not just, it feels like this. I remember my favorite psychiatrist would say, this is not an emotional state.
Did I say that?
No, my favorite psychiatrist.
Oh, God damn. Okay.
Go ahead.
So then she talks about that transference, countertransference is the therapy, while other focus on theory and techniques. I mean,
Well, for some
I think,
therapies, the transference
yeah.
is like transference focused psychotherapy as an example.
Sure, but it's not just that the transference and the countertransference are happening. It's like you said that the transference is being highlighted, commented on, interpreted, right? I mean, I think that is, transference focused psychotherapy or psychodynamic psychotherapy, the things that are the types of therapies that are focused on the relationship and the interaction within the room. And there are, there's a lot of theory and technique about how to do that. But I think, go ahead.
No, just a plug for transference focused psychotherapy. The research primarily with personality disorders like borderline and narcissistic. So if you're interested in this kind of work, it is fascinating. But you're right, there's plenty of theory and technique. And I would say, I mean, some therapies, so Michelle's, it sounds like her training is really with cognitive behavioral therapy. So they may not focus on the transference as an intervention, but that's not to say that the therapist isn't monitoring it, because I mean, that is one of the ways that you would assess the alliance. And I think it's a good thing for therapists to be comfortable with these kinds of theories, because in my opinion, at least, it can make the therapy so much richer.
Well, and I think it gets both people out of the state of just reacting. I mean, that I think it can build more curiosity, maybe more empathy, maybe not, but this way of, if a patient is, I don't know, resistant in some way, or it's like, oh, they're so frustrating. I know I keep thinking of the therapist from last week because the examples were so egregious, right? But this way of just like, if things don't go the way the therapist thinks they ought to, I think that the transference countertransference kind of framework avoids patient blaming a little bit. I mean, it doesn't mean the patient's not responsible, but that maybe there could be some flexibility in the technique, even if it's a CBT technique, let's say, to help deal with that. I mean, I feel like there was even a follow-up book by one of the Becks that was about advanced cases or difficult cases in cognitive behavioral therapy. And it was all about like, what if somebody doesn't do their homework? What if somebody is non-compliant? And a lot of it, if I remember it correctly, really was exploring these like personality and relationship dynamics as a way to kind of get back to the CBT as the main goal. So maybe they saw the transference countertransference in a way as like an obstacle to the work, but like still something that needed to be worked with to kind of get back to the main objective. So I think anybody could benefit from understanding it.
Yeah. So again, whether it's how much attention you pay to it, it's got to be the difference in, well, it's one of the reasons why I don't think the bots, the CBT automated responses and apps are going to replace that human connection, so that you can actually explore why something might not be working. What are the barriers to this not working?
How has your approach evolved over time?
I'm less uptight. Yeah, I've gotten better over time.
I think I've gotten better at maybe kind of understanding or intuiting the timing of things, because it may not be the right time, even if it's that kind of therapy, to explicitly state the transference you're noting. So maybe a better way to say that is I think I've grown more patient and kind of believing and recognizing that I'm going to have more opportunities. So if I can see something as a transference or a transference pattern, I'm going to have a lot more chances to bring it up, right? Like I don't have to pounce on it the first time I see it, because if this is this person's MO, like it's going to happen again. And to kind of have a better sense of when people can hear it, when I have enough evidence or enough evidence has been presented that I think the patient can hear it too, instead of just being some sort of different kind of robot or seeming like a therapy robot that's just like, you're treating me as if I was your mother. And, that might be true. It probably is true. But I think being right and being tactful and being therapeutic are not always the same thing. And also probably admitting more when I'm not right. But go ahead.
It sounded like a long way for you to not say trust the process. Trust the process.
I mean, trust the process. Like, you have to not be afraid to say anything. There's a lot of people I've trained who are afraid to say anything.
Oh, wow.
And I don't think that was the thing I suffered from.
Yeah, that's one thing. More concrete thing I've had to change is not saying as much.
Yeah.
And not that I was ever uncomfortable with silence, but just I think for the most part, like being really active can be helpful, but there are times when you just don't need to be that active. I mean, again, it's not that I mind silence; it's that I don't have to rush the person along. Like I don't have to put quite as many breadcrumbs down. It's okay just to be, and maybe it's just a different way of saying, as you were saying, just to be more patient and let it happen.
Right. Both with I think the patient and with myself, and in terms of like the approach evolving, I think lots of therapists describe themselves as taking an eclectic approach. And sometimes maybe that's kind of lazy or a way of saying like you just do whatever you want. But I do think, you can hone your clinical intuition over time. But I think it was helpful to me to kind of learn the rules before I broke them, kind of deal. Or I guess learn the rules before I decided of different things in a way to try to cobble things together. I mean, most practicing therapists I know are going to draw from some CBT, draw from some psychodynamics, DBT, coping skills, whatever. I mean, I think ultimately I just want to be helpful, but having a framework to work from, especially if I feel like I'm getting lost or feel like I'm discombobulated is a nice way to be able to step back and try to locate yourself and what's going on. And for me, the psychodynamic framework was the most helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's good advice for therapists just starting out, which is the next question. But I agree with you. It's okay to be eclectic as long as you've done the work and you've worked on mastery of some other of one thing,
right,
or a couple of things. And then if you want to become more eclectic between those, I think that's great. But
maybe find the limits of the thing that do your thing, right? Like do CBT, and then if you can find places where you tend to get stuck or run into trouble, then maybe that's a place for kind of a different technique or bringing something else in.
Oh, I had one other thing about my evolution.
Oh, you do? Okay, great.
So the first critical feedback I ever got from a supervisor when I was in training from my favorite psychiatrist was that I was technically good. Like I had the theory, I had the technique, had good powers of observation, but I needed to be more open to the experience of the relationship. Her actual words were that I needed to be down in the muck more with the patient. And she was right, but it took me years to actually fully understand what she meant and to be able to open myself up enough emotionally to actually be engaged in that way.
Oh, nice. Well, so that's actually a great bridge because one of probably my favorite supervisor ever said that, gave me some nice compliments, but said that the thing that I needed was a conviction that therapy worked and that specifically this type of therapy would work. And she was a psychodynamic supervisor. And that leads to my most important piece of advice I was going to give Michelle is to get therapy yourself. And, in a way, it can be to, hone your technique. But I think the way I got my conviction was because it was so life-changing and effective for me to do that kind of therapy that made me believe that it would work for other people, have a conviction, want to get more training in it. But even if you don't go on to practice that, psychodynamics or whatever, Michelle, that is also a really great way to know yourself and know maybe where your blind spots or weaknesses, what your countertransferences might be, your own typical transferences. And then that is a great way to kind of weed through that with your patients and go back to one of Dave's fundamental questions about like, is it them or is it me?
So other bits of advice. So I think we had a lot. Like I agree with you about the therapy. I would also just point out that if Michelle wants to pursue more about the psychodynamic, it sounds like she's had some classwork. She's obviously been reading some papers, but a supervisor is really essential. There's only so much you can get without having a supervisor. I mean, it sounds like a lot to have both your therapist and your supervisor, but I think that's important.
Yeah, I mean, those are the three pillars of that kind of training is your personal work, your supervision, and then your coursework, which is all that theory and technique that we were talking about earlier.
My last things are, just throwaway pithy things.
Love it.
Just remember you're an expert, but your client is the expert of their own mind. So don't make too many assumptions.
Okay, great.
And my final thing is don't get too calcified. So always be open to learning more. Well, I think we talked about this, that, other approaches may be better than the one for the problem at hand. So I see a lot of times you just don't want to be that person with a hammer and everything's a nail. It's fine to have a hammer, but just recognize that this doesn't work all the time. And so, maybe it's like, I have other approaches or techniques, or I just, I find the better fit. Like I refer you to somebody else. And then I love Yalom's book, The Gift of Therapy. He kind of wrote that for therapists starting out. So if you haven't read that, it's a very slim volume. It won't take you long to get through, but I think it's very nice.
I think that is very nice. I actually, when I supervise residents, because I get to be a psychodynamic supervisor now, there are 2 books that I ask them to get and read. That is one that will make you feel good about your chosen profession. It's beautiful, right? It's very heartening. He's just like a lovely person. It comes through on every page. And then the other one is by Jane Hall, and it's called Deepening the Treatment. And what I like about that book is that she lays out all of these rules of psychodynamic psychotherapy with examples and like a very clear-cut justification as to why we use them or why this is the ideal. I think there are parts in it that seem almost too stiff and too silly, but I think it goes back to that, it's really nice to know the structure and the rules before you decide to bend it. And I think that it's like the most clear in terms of laying a framework. And then after that, you can go learn the nuances if you just kind of want to understand where these people are coming from. Like she's an analyst in a very classic sense, but you don't need to have any kind of prior experience with psychodynamic psychotherapy to read that. And again, you don't have to do things as formally as she does, but I think it's a straightforward way of kind of getting started.
All right, Michelle, I hope there's something in there that's helpful. And again, congratulations. And let us know.
Have fun. You'll never be bored. It's the best.
All right. Thank you all for listening. And a special thanks to Danny and Michelle for the questions. We need to hear from you. We need your feedback. We need you to write your thoughts on the app you're using to listen to this. And of course, we love your email. You can leave an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. If you don't want to use our website, just email us directly at callthepsychiatrist@gmail.com. The DMs are open on Instagram and Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. And lastly, tell somebody about the show. Help us grow the show. Take care.
Bye.